Hello, and welcome to I Am Dad podcast with your fatherhood authority, Kenneth Braswell. 30 minutes of wisdom, information, resources, and nuggets on your fatherhood journey. Or maybe you're just curious and want to hear some real talk about fatherhood, family, and the minds of men. Well, guess what? We got you too. Sit back, grab your pad and pen, and maybe even bring a little something to sip on. Enjoy 30 straight minutes of fatherhood, family, and fun with the fatherhood authority, Kenneth Braswell.
Welcome to another groundbreaking episode of I Am Dad podcast. Today we are honored to have Ludo Gabriele, a global authority on masculinity and gender equity. Join us as the founder of Humen Leaders and the mind behind the influential pre-Me Too blog, WokeDaddy.com. Ludo has dedicated over a decade to transforming how we understand masculinity and engage men in creating a more equitable world. Through his work with leading initiatives like Men Advocating Real Change and his advisory practice, Ludo has helped organizations worldwide bridge the empathy gap and redefine the relationship between men and diversity, equity, and inclusion. His insights have been featured on platforms such as Forbes, the BBC, and Vice, making him a trusted voice on building healthier, more inclusive narratives for boys and men. Today, we'll explore Ludo's journey, his work in promoting healthy masculinity, and the critical role of fathers in shaping the next generation. Please join me as we bring on to the stage my new friend and colleague, Ludo Gabriele. How are you doing today, sir?
Well, much better since we started talking. It's a pleasure to be with you.
No, thank you. Like I said, off camera, I have been following your work, admire your work. I watch your posts and read them every day. They inspire me to write on my own and to do more public expressions of my voice, not only through my work, but through what I've learned in this specific space over the last 20 years, and to begin to start bridging the gap between the narrative that we have to adjust and the work on the ground, working specifically in my space in the field of responsible fatherhood and working with men and seeing this masculinity thing play out day to day with men, and then also seeing the impact on their children, my children. I have two boys that I'm growing up in my house right now, a 15 and a 17-year-old. So I'm seeing how it's impacting them as well. So I just want to thank you for your passion, for the work, for your stick-to-itiveness, and making sure that this conversation stays at the top of it needs to be if we even are any level of serious about strengthening our families. Oh, we start our show off with a very kind of intimate, question because it level sets the conversation. It gives my audience a sense of like where some of what you're doing may come from. And it's very simple. You can tell this however you want to, from whatever perspective you want to. Tell us your daddy's story.
Well, my daddy's story started that work essentially. So when I became a father pretty early in my journey. I was 27 when my son was born. And during the first 2.5 years of his life, I was not necessarily very present. I was home, but I was working a lot, right? And it took me feeling extremely unfulfilled with my job and my duty and seeing what I was missing at home to question what type of father I wanted to be. I missed his first steps, for instance, missed important part of his 2.5 years of existence at that moment. So I decided to quit my job with nothing in front of me. Where I come from, that's not something that you do, both from a social standpoint and also from a role modeling standpoint. So fatherhood has opened my heart. That's what I would say. It really kicked off a real journey into the man that I would like to be moving forward.
Talk to me a little bit about the inspiration, because often people will ask me, like, how did you get into this work? Like, where did you go to school? People think that there is an academic path to what you and I do. And I always explain to them, no, it wasn't an academic path. It was just simply a matter of life be lifing. And as I began to move along, that part of my life began to crystallize, and it began to become part of what I call my calling and my purpose. And that's how I got here. So for me, it's not about my title, it's about my position. I am positioned to do this work because of how I grew up, how I interpret how I grew up, how I grew up has impacted me, and how I want to help others as a result of that. Talk to me a little bit about your journey and your inspiration of doing this work.
Well, I grew up so I'm a French native. I grew up in the south of France. Not with the imagery that you may think about. I grew up in the project, so I grew up in an hyper violent environment, not inside my home, but outside of it, where a very narrow version of masculinity with everything that you can think about dominates, right? So I grew up with those ideas, but by also being a very sensitive boy. So
Mm-hmm.
I recall distancing myself from this side of me because it was literally unsafe to show that, right? And that's something that just kept going up until I started to question those issues. Because when you are, in my case, 31, married, you have kid, you have a wife, you own your house, and you feel miserable,
Mm-hmm.
this is when you start out asking yourself the hard questions. And one of the questions that I asked myself was, why am I feeling miserable?
Mm-hmm.
And when I quit my job, what I was saying before is that two things happened. The first thing that happened was my heart opened, as I said before, because I connected with my son in a way that I don't think one was possible. And also that I didn't even know if it was okay to feel like this as a man, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then after 2 months, kind of, really embracing that bonding that I had with my son, I started to question myself. Are
Mm-hmm.
you one of those guys now? Like,
Mm-hmm.
are you one of those guys that stay at home, that don't provide an income? Never happened to me before. I had money in front of me. So
Mm-hmm.
that was not like you have to go back to work. But it kind of invited me to step into a rabbit hole of questioning the things that I've thought I knew, question the ideas of what it meant to be a man, where they come from, what I have accepted without even questioning. And man, I gotta tell you, when you start entering that rabbit hole, it's very difficult to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I never did, essentially.
And that's a good thing, right? And I love the epiphany points of life because it does. Um, there's a slide in one of my presentations that is a quote from Denzel Washington in Equalizer 2, where he says there are two kinds of pains in the world, a pain that hurts you and a pain that alters you. And I think my work came out of the pain that altered me, which is where I want to lean in with you, because you started Human Leaders. And, there's always, I think, in many people that I talk to that are extremely passionate about whatever kind of work they do, there was this moment where they said to themselves, you know what, enough is enough. Like, I really got to figure out how I'm going to tackle this issue, but I have to structuralize it. Right? I can't just go out and just start yelling from the rooftops and hope that someone's going to hear me. I have to structuralize how I'm going to do this. I'm going to structuralize what I'm going to say. I have to structuralize what this is going to look like, who I want to talk to, and what I'm trying to accomplish. What was that thing that hit you, that said to you, you know what? I got to do something different and I got to do something more?
I got laid off.
Mm,
So I got laid off last year, being the senior director of branding of the Men Advocating Real Change Initiative at Catalyst, which is a nonprofit organization who works for the advancement of women in the workplace, so DEI work essentially.
mhm,
So It was extremely unexpected to be laid off because it's a very successful initiative. So I didn't see it coming. It's very hard. It was very heartbreaking. And what I identify in during my work there is this idea of the role of men in gender equity being solely focused on being allies for others, and never being beneficiaries of initiatives for themselves, like a kind of a blind spot, which was more or less consciously put aside, which I had kind of addressed already during my employment, through the work that I did, through the numerous speaking engagement that I did, through the large convenings that I created, but also seeing that there is such an antagonistic state of the masculinity conversation that there is no, unfortunately, existing platform which are productive and non-zero sum oriented that was existing. And just taking out the ideology part of gender equity and looking at the data, just at looking at plain data, men are not doing well. They just are not, like you can take it in any forms that you want. If you accept the idea that men are human beings, start looking at them as human beings, which is we die earlier, lonelier, and sicker all over the world. And that has consequences on our family, that has consequences on women, that has consequences of people who do not identify on the binary. So what are we doing? Are we just going to pretend that narratives about boys and men are not solely focused on talking about the most successful men and the most harmful men? I'm not saying that we should not discuss them, but if you do that and use those narratives as a representation of the culture, you are simply running a grave misdiagnosis, which is ideologically induced, and you're not fixing the problem, who are at the root causes of many of the things that are happening in society today. So I was like, we need to humanize men. We need to humanize men the way we see them, the way we talk about them, and the way we value them. Because when you look at the data of men when they step outside of masculine norms, which we are being asked to do every single day, by the way, the world does not welcome us when we do that. And we need to address this.
Yeah, you said a couple of things that, man, it's amazing how much we think alike and how many of the words that pass through that you're speaking that's passed through my mind. And I've said, in spaces where I'm speaking, whether it's about maternity health, whether it's about, DEI, gender equity, and all those things, it's always we always have to level set the room when you and I speak. I'm listening to the cadence of your voice, and I'm listening to how we always have to be mindful that my wife tells me all the time, or she used to tell me, I got the message now, I get it. My wife always says, you can say anything to anybody. It's just how you say it and how you make them feel after you say it. And so you can have the most difficult conversations with people. But if you take your time to figure out how to have that difficult conversation and at least make them walk away curious, maybe not approval, but at least curious, to slow them down to listen more, you've won half the battle. And so I remember being in a meeting, I think it was last year, with Gary Barker and others from Equimundo in LA. They were supporting some work with Oh my goodness, I can't think of the actress's name that does the work on women's rights and stuff. And so she was in this room. There's about 15, 20 of us in the room. And they kept using the word, and you used it, kept using the word allies. And every time they would like use it, my mind would be like, "Ugh, I hate that word." I said, but I need to say that, but I need to figure out how to say that so that I can get everybody to understand where I'm coming from when I say it. So finally I got him, and I kind of said, I said, I'll be honest with you. I was like, I didn't come all the way out here to look for another ally. I don't need another ally. And I'm not here to offer my allyship. I said, what I am here is to find partners. And I said, and let me tell you the difference between an ally and a partner. An ally is someone that you ask to work and advocate on behalf of your cause, but you don't show interest in their cause. A partner is you show interest in my cause, and I show interest in your cause, so that I speak your name in rooms that you're not there, and you speak my name in rooms that I'm not there. That's equity. That's partnership. And so if we're not about the common goal at the end of the day, which is how do we construct our families, our parents individually, but our family, because we are at the end of the day about healthy child well-being. We are concerned about children. The reason that we do this work is because we are concerned so much about children. But our way of dealing with that is strengthening the capacity of men to show up in a way that they are productive in the lives of their children, regardless of their romantic and residential circumstance. That's what we're here for. We're here for the same reason you're here. And if we can agree upon that, we can be partners. If we can't agree upon that, we definitely not going to be allies. When you're out there talking about this work and you're in rooms and you're really trying to get your message across, Ludo, what are some of the challenges with you in ensuring that your message actually resonate with the people you're talking to?
First of all, thank you for saying what you just said, because the allyship terminology is also something that I struggle with. Do you mind if I say a couple of words about that? Because I think,
Absolutely. Go ahead. This is your floor.
um, well, first of all, the issue with allyship is also that when you have allies, that means that you have enemies. So
Mhm.
there is just a warfare undertone that I believe is not necessarily conducive of global culture change, especially because we know how much DEI terminology is tainted with political undertone. So
Mhm.
that's what I would say. Then, especially allyship in the context of male allyship, first of all, it just perpetrate uh, patriarchal view. I don't like that term, but I'm just going to use it for the sake of explaining myself, because it kind of reinforces the idea that there is a savior syndrome. I'm your ally. I need to save you, which I
Mhm.
think is extremely disempowering for the people needing allyship. And also, it just kind of reinforces the dynamic of superior inferior. Um, in the context of male allyship, unfortunately, in the gender equity conversation, this is the only way in which we characterize men's role, right? So when we talk about men's role, we only talk about what men can do in behalf of others, but we do not invite the idea that men also need help. So
Right.
it kind of just perpetuate this one directional dynamic, which is which is unhelpful, because it also perpetuates the idea that men do not need help, which is also a very stereotypical view of being a man. So for all those reasons, I do not talk about allyship, but I invite people to embrace a more expansive view of leadership,
Mhm.
because this is what we want essentially. We know that masculine norms have traditionally shaped leadership norms in a very outward way. We talk about hard skills, right? To me, if you take a more holistic view of leadership, it means that you're able to lead in outward ways, but you are also able to take the other as part of yourself. So that
Mm-hmm.
means empathy, compassion, understanding, listening, humility. So I wanted to say that because I think it's an important conversation, because we know right now one of the reasons why DEI is receiving so much pushback, it is because it is perceived as ideological. And if we keep using terminology that reinforce that belief, unfortunately DEI is still going to be facing backlash. And it's very unfortunate, because DEI is really essentially the human side of an organization. Um, but to go back to your question of how people are receiving my message, there are two types of people. There are two categories of people. And I have to preface what I'm going to say with the fact that before starting to publicly talk about the men's side of this conversation, I have a track record of advocating for women and girls for like
Yeah,
7 years. So
Mm-hmm.
people know that I am not a misandrist or an anti-woman in disguise, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I have actual skin in the games.
Mm-hmm.
I've proven my advocacy way before this was popular. So a lot of people trust what I have to say because they know me. They know
Mm-hmm.
me. They know my value. They know what I stand for as a human beings. So there is an element of trust that I've gained through the work that I've done. So a lot of those people are, even if they are uncomfortable or do not agree with me, are willing to listen. Then there are two types of people who vehemently disagree with me and are usually aggressive. They are very misogynistic people who believe, for example, when I say that we should not shame men for wanting to engage in early education career or being a nurse or staying at home. Those guys hate that. They really
Mm-hmm.
do. And then there's misandrist. So people who really do not like men and do not accept the idea that men should be recipient of gender equity initiative. Um, and those people, um, though they might appear opposite side of the spectrum, especially when in politics, for example, when you talk about the far right or the far left, you see it like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I see those people as a circle. They are actually very similar people. They have the same arguments, the same vitriol, the same inability to see other people as having a different life experience. And usually those people will never understand that message,
Mm-hmm.
because they are not interested in building bridges, and that's okay. There is a lot of people in the DEI space will tell you that they are here because they are inclusive leaders, or that um, they want everybody to thrive. But I would tell you that I received comments from highly credentialed people who would essentially tell me that DEI is not here to build bridges. That's just not the way it works, right? That this is not. So there is just a deeply polarized conversation, and the only thing that you can own and that you can control is your intention. Are you looking to convert someone, or are you looking to connect with them?
Mm-hmm.
And based on that choice and based on that your intention, you usually attract the right people to connect with your message.
Yeah, we are similar in the sense that I love what you said about the track record is there. And so you know who I am, you trust my word, and you trust my intention. And you've seen my work, which is why we are so deeply embedded in providing direct services for men. Because it's very difficult for you to say that I care about a particular man when I can point to you tens of thousands of men and their families associated with. and their children that's attached to them that we continue to help to this day. And so it is very clear that we are about family. I was at a forum not too long ago, and a really good friend of mine, Dr. Brandon Frame, he runs an organization here called The Black Man Can. And he was being interviewed, and the moderator said to him, he said, there's a um, historical quote. He says, and I would love to get your thought on it. And it was Frederick Douglass's quote that says, it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And Dr. Frame said, I really don't like that quote. And I was like, whoa, I had never heard that before. I'm like, wait, why? Everybody uses that quote. Like, that's the standard quote, like when you're talking on our work. And he says, but let me tell you why I don't like it. He says, because what the quote leaves open is that it's okay to leave men broken. That we're so leaning into repairing building strong children that we just kick men to the side and we're okay with them being broken. I had never heard that before. Changed my entire perspective with respect to how we use terminology and how we use narrative as a support of our message. But oftentimes those same things are to the detriment of the message, which of the work that we're trying to create and what it is we're trying to do. Another good friend of mine, Dr. Armand Perry, was on the panel, and he was talking about being a child welfare worker. And he said he was going along in his work trying and thought that he was doing a work of really saving children and putting children in the best situations to thrive. When one day he looked up and realized that as a social worker, he was complicit in the worst things that were happening for children because he was just following the rules. And I was like, whoa, that is always the lock that I'm trying to unlock with my words and with my work. That it seems like, Ludo, that you mentioned a cohort of the people who are within who we are talking about and who are surrounding our conversation. But sometimes to me, it is about how many sober-minded, healthy, spirit-led people can I unlock to begin to start seeing something that they've never been exposed to before. And I believe that some of that work in my space is around leaning on the fact that these same men that we're talking about are fathers and that they are responsible for children. When you think about you being a dad and the work that you're doing in masculinity, how much of the work that you do is generated by the father you show up to be?
100%. It's 100%. Because at the end of the day, so I'm not a big fan of that quote either, what you just mentioned. And the reason why is that how are you going to raise healthy children with broken men if you don't fix them first? Number one, and I think it starts with this. It starts by acknowledging that male disposability is just the blind spot of the gender equity conversation. If you do not address that, if you do not address that we are not taught or we are not socialized to think about men as struggling, needing help, deserving help, we will never get into a place where we can all heal in the partnered way. It's very uncomfortable accepting the idea that men are struggling, because if you turn on the TV, you will never know that, number one, and number two, a man who struggles is not going to tell you. Wow. You know, there is a man that I love for the work that he does. His name is Jason Wilson. He's an author. He works with it. Okay. So he says this: any man who does not cry in other ways. And when you take that quote, you understand that a lot of the pain and the hurt of men, because is has violence as a consequence, we are only focused on the violence, and we are not addressing the pain, until we do that work, until we acknowledge and see men as full human beings, not for what they do, but for who they are as human beings. We will never make progress holistically in gender equity. So for the father that I am a father of two. I have a 13-year-old boy and a 7-year-old daughter. I see the different narratives around raising girls and raising boys. Raising a girl is is inspirational, you know. As a girl, especially in the Western world, you can do anything, you can be anything, you can be strong, all of those things, right? If you compare the narrative about being a boy or being a healthy boy, because we have conflated as a society the traditional part of masculinity with the toxic part of masculinity, there is no inspirational message as it comes to raising a boy. And there is a lot of harmful masculinist voices who are competing for the attention because they are filling the void that is just left blatant by all of us to provide an actual guidance, a masculine guidance to boys. So, as a man and as a dad, I would tell you two things. Number one, I have failed to see a nuanced masculine voice in my journey for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
So I am trying in my very humble way to provide language and terminology to say, listen, traditional masculinity is not toxic masculinity. This is the helpful part of masculinity. This is the toxic part of masculinity. And masculinity doesn't mean men. There are plenty of women who are full of toxic masculinity if you look at them as human traits, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a dad, I feel that my responsibility is to role model the things that I've learned and to provide language to express those ideas to other people. And in my home, it means having extreme close proximity with my son, because I will tell you this, I started that work, the gender equity work, for my daughter, because I discovered how difficult it is to be a girl and a woman in this world, and all of the things that we do not see, you know, the cat calling, all the the sense of unsafety that you have at whole time, the things that you have to cover, the things that you have to navigate, right? But I am continuing that work for my son, because not only the path to integrated masculinity is extremely uncertain, but there is no compassion for his experience. And without compassion, we cannot make progress. I believe that with my entire soul.
Yeah, yeah, I have 4 daughters. They're all out of the house now, and my son was a surprise blessing, and so that's what my wife and I call him. We weren't expecting him, but it was the only element of life that I hadn't had yet, and that was raising a boy. And so I think in God's way, it was, if you're going to do this work, you have to really kind of experience in what it looks like to raise a boy, um, given that a man wasn't in your life to raise you. And the two things that I always lean on with my son and my nephew in the house is that never leave your voice on the floor. Because if you leave your voice on the floor, you allow people to step on it, and it
Mm.
gives you the propensity to step on your own voice. So never leave your voice on the floor. Always make your voice known. And the second thing is, to be the most effective in your voice, you have to be empathetic. And so sympathy allows you to care without action. Empathy won't let you go to sleep at night. And so, regardless of who it is, whether it's another woman, whether it's a man, whether it's a puppy, whether it's a tree, if you empathize with another person's challenges of life, you're going to always be the best person to show up for that individual. And it is my way of not having to dig so much in the nuances of what you and I are dealing with, but a strength pattern that allows him to navigate no matter what the narrative is, that he still is able to kind of move, through that space. Do you think a lot of what, or at least some of, I would say a lot of, the fear in our conversation is a fear of the past and not going back to what could be described as a very misogynistic society that did not value the lives of women, did not value the lives of girls, and that the kind of men in the power structure then looked a certain way that is, one could say, expressive, to your point, in the media. And so we get overwhelmed by these messages and images that we see, and it reminds us, it's almost like a, what do they call it in psychiatry? Oh my goodness, it's a trigger. Microaggression.
Mhm.
It's a microaggression. It is, this feels like something. It feels like something I saw and it wasn't good for me. Do you think we get caught up in not letting go of the past and understanding that we are evolving?
I think a lot of people, as I was saying before, by solely talking about seeing men through the lens of power and privilege, when you do that, you will only, if you only frame them in that way, especially in the story that you tell about them, they're only going to show up in that way.
Mm,
So, and we saw that with the last US elections.
mhm,
That's, without leaning on one side or the other, if you have a cold analysis of it, a very sober analysis, there was one side that embraced masculinity. I'm not saying that it's the right or the wrong way, and I just one that completely ignored it.
mm,
And I would say that 90% of men do not resonate with either or. That's my interpretation
mhm,
of it,
mhm,
because where we are stuck in our culture is that we double down on social identities and identity instead of talking about the culture. When you
mm,
when you talk about the culture of inequity, because it's a fact, instead of looking at identity, you can have a conversation that is collective and connecting, where you can say, all right, in the culture in which we live, instead of saying this is a patriarchy where men oppress women, you can say in the culture in which we live, there is a high level of violence against women. They get discriminated in X, Y, and Z place. They don't get paid at the same, at the same level. And men are dying sooner, lonelier, and sicker. Men
mhm,
who are looking for help for domestic violence have no space to go. Men who are facing divorce have a much higher propensity to not be in touch with their children. Men represent 99% of the carceral population. Men represent 90% of. So you see what I'm trying to
yeah,
say, right?
mhm,
So
mhm,
when we get out of the identity trap and we look at the culture and how it affects different groups and different people, this is where we create connection.
mm,
And I
right.
think this is a work that has not well been done. I think it was purposely done for political gains to focus on certain groups.
Mhm.
And we are simply paying the price for it, the collective price, that is.
Yeah, I was on a panel the other day talking about Black maternal health. And I was just listening to the dialogue going back and forth. And I was like, you know what? I just want to take an opportunity to kind of level set the conversation, because it was leaning towards how fathers should show up in the space and what men should do to help moms in those critical spaces. And I said, let me be clear that the reason that I am so passionate, and the gentleman who was next to me, who was also, leaning in on the fatherhood male piece in a room full of women, who was there to talk about Black maternal health. Um, the work that we do is not because we solely and only care about men. Like, we're here because we care about families. And more importantly, this conversation around maternal health is very intimate to us, because if you start thinking about what's happening on the birthing table and women losing their lives, and more specifically in greater numbers, Black women losing their lives, you're talking about my daughters. You're talking about my mother. You're talking about my grandmother. You're talking about my auntie. You're talking about my cousins. You're talking about my pastor's wife. You're talking about my congregation. You're talking about my next door neighbor. How could I possibly not care about that? Like, it doesn't make sense. Let's make it make sense. And if we could just make it make sense, we can have a connection and a dialogue that helps you understand that I'm with you. But to your point, they don't tell you anymore, ironically, now that I'm thinking about it, but they used to tell you when you got on the plane that when the oxygen mask dropped, you put your mask on first so you can save everybody around you. It seemed like we've forgotten that. So now everybody is just grabbing for the mask, and there's chaos on the plane, and the plane is going down. And the one thing that we know about it when it hits the ground is we're all going to have concrete poisoning. Everybody on the plane is going to have concrete poisoning. What's the work? What do we need to do, Ludo? How do you and I and others that think at least in this way move forward and create an environment where we can have conversations that create greater connection?
So I would say be brave enough to be nuanced, and take ownership of how the worlds perceive you. The world does not perceive men and women the same way. That's just a fact of life. They do not perceive a Black man and a white man the same way. So you can accept that reality, and also being brave enough to say things that may sound controversial. If you come from a place of wanting to build bridges, you need to be willing to say things that are not going to sound good. And unfortunately, this has a cost. It cost me. I know I'm not doing as good as if I was just running a male allyship program. And that's leadership. I know that this is the right thing to do. I know that this is important to have a voice who says that men are human beings, and that if we only talk about them in the way that they are hurtful, they're only going to show up in a way that is hurtful. If we are only talking about the top 1% of men, when we talk about them, you're making the other 99% completely invisible. And that's not popular. That's not palatable. That's what I've been told. It's not palatable to care about men. Let that sink in for a second. It's not palatable to care about men. But when I say male disposability is the blind spot of the gender conversation, people are like, how dare you say things like that? I'm like, you just told me it's not palatable to care about men.
Right.
Hello. So right now there's a rise of figures who are extremely harmful, who are highly profiting from the despair and the pain of men. And that is hugely unfair. It's very dangerous for democracy, especially in a country that where we live, where there is a lot of guns in circulation. So I'm not a religious person, but I'm deeply spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
I know in my heart that caring about men in 2024, while it's not a popular message, this is what we have to do for our sons, for our daughters, for our mothers and fathers, because men's well-being, holistic well-being, impacts all of us.
Yeah. You know, um, wow. Thank you for all of that. You're shaping things in my mind, and I know that the work is the answer for you and I is just continue to do what we're doing, right? And so, but you do have to agitate, right? You do
Yes.
have to say things that make people uncomfortable. At the end of the day, this is out of all of the social work disciplines, eerily, this feels like the most personal when we're talking about men and women, gender.
Yeah.
It is that thing, but it should also be the most relatable, right?
I mean, I agree with you, and I would tell you this: we are in a weird time about to talk about gender nowadays because suddenly we're supposed to forget that there is a biological also reality to gender, that there is a evolutionary reality to gender, and that's the first way in which we identify in the world. So that of course it matters, and of course, as I said before, the world does not respond the same way if you're a boy or a girl, and that's just life. The question is, how are we going to do about that?
Yeah. My daughter, some time ago, we were having a conversation, and it was a random conversation. If you're talking to you'll experience this when your daughter gets older. Like sometimes our girls can be so intimate in their conversation when they feel comfortable, they'll say things as a matter of fact, and you'll hear it a different way. Like
Mhm.
I remember when my daughter and I went to go see Taken,
Mm.
and I was disturbed for almost a week after that. We enjoyed the movie, but there was another narrative that was playing out for me in that movie. And that was, my God, if I have to be Liam Neeson in order to save my daughter, like I'm not that kind of man. Like I can't do anything about that. And I this fear kind of grew in me about my ability to be able to not provide for my daughter, but protect my daughter. Right. And it amplified in my head. But we were talking, and she said that she didn't like going to the gas station. And I was like, why? And she was like, because every time I go to the gas station, there's always some guy who's trying to like talk to me
Mhm.
at the gas station. And I just became curious. I'm not curious, furious, because I knew the answer could not be, you know what, from now on, bring me your car. I'll go put gas in your car.
Mhm.
That, right? That's not the answer.
No, that's not the answer. The answer to me is use, teach, or encourage self-defense as a life skill, and you know what I mean. Because you're not gonna be behind your daughter at all time. Also, do not feel shameful about wanting to protect your family, because as a man nowadays, we have also this disgusting narrative that shame men for wanting to protect their family, because we
Mhm.
are, this patriarch figure that wants to. It's a hugely caring way to care about people. You don't need, just because you want to protect them, it doesn't mean that you want to dominate them. I just had to say that because that really bothers me when
Mhm.
ideologues say things like this. But the only thing that you can do is, first of all, what you just described is you were listening to your daughter's experience, and you saw life through what it is to be a woman nowadays, and that's something that is completely invisible to us. So that's
Right.
something that we need to do early and constantly, so that we can also raise boys in a way, or influence boys in a way that this will not happen. But
Mhm.
aside from that, um, you're not gonna lock your daughters up. What you can do is
Right.
help her navigate the world.
Right. Yeah, no. One last thing before I close it out. I mean, you said something and it was really around, how we um the biological aspect of this conversation, is
Yes.
something that I always, recognize in our work around responsible fatherhood. And I say often, that often when we think about moms, we never disconnect the fact that moms are women. But for some odd reason, when we talk about dads, we want to disconnect the fact that dads are men. You can't disconnect who they are as men and what they bring to the table. An example of that is there was a story not too long ago here where dad's daughter was being bullied on a school bus and he got tired. And the next day, the school bus rolled up. He ran onto the school bus, to confront the person who was bullying his child. And it was all over the media. It's like, how dare could he run on a school bus? And I was like, yeah, could I say I would have never done that?
No. Well, that's also, I mean, I talk about biology to be a bit, not to be controversial, but I think there is more than just the gender binary. And also, if you do not accept the idea that evol- evolu- the evolution of who we are is also the result of millions of years of evolution, that testosterone impacts our body the same way, that in a very specific way, and that there
Mhm.
is just a reality of who we are, and that if in your body um, you have the capacity to create life or not, you're not gonna have the same body experience, and that informs very very intimately the way you're gonna want to perform in the world. If we have a reptilian brain and we accept that, we need to accept also that having a certain set of genitalia and hormones also inform the way we see the world, and we know that testosterone affect the way it are closely correlated with men's health. And
Absolutely.
that's just the way it is. That's not my opinion.
Yeah, no, but with respect to the gentleman that ran on the bus, my response was, we could debate all day the action. We could also debate the consequence of the action. But what we can't debate is what drove it,
Hmm.
right? What drove it is something different. It is what men in general are held accountable for: protection,
Yes.
right? Particularly over girls. So we can talk about the act and we can talk about the consequence, but the drive is not debatable, right? And that is innate in us when
Yes.
it comes to our children, particularly our
Yes.
girls, our wives, and especially our mothers, right? It's in there. So to start the narrative off with "we don't care" is a non-truth.
Yes.
And we got to move to a more truthful start than a start that's driven by emotion based on historical context and historical consequence of the life you've lived, because that's where that comes from. The emotional and historical baggage that you carry as a result of the impact of a dysfunctional relationship or a bad experience with a man that now has driven you to believe that not just this person was bad, but all of them are bad. And if you say all, then you have to be inclusive of your sons, your fathers, your uncles, your nephews, and anyone else in your life who happens to be male. And so that's my soapbox. Ludo, do me a favor. There are fathers who might be listening to this and really want to hear from you some advice on raising their boys. And what can you say to them that they can do with their boys to help them embrace empathy, respect, and inclusion?
Start with yourself.
Mm,
Take care of yourself. There's a part of you that is unhealed, and that is that is chipping away every single day.
Mm.
If you do not show compassion to yourself, you will never be able to fully show it to somebody else, and that includes your son. And that's the best gift that you can give him, because a son who sees his dad taking care of himself knows that he can do it himself as well.
Thank you so much. Tell people how they can get in touch with you, learn more about your work, and even support you.
Right now, just follow me on LinkedIn. This is the only place that I chose to keep my thought leadership. I write every single day. So Ludo Gabriele, LUDO GABRIELE. You will find me. Follow me. Send me a request. I'm here every single day.
Ludo, thanks so much. You are a treasure and a pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise, sir. Thank you very much for having me.
Appreciate you. And to all of my I Am Dad podcast listeners, thank you for listening again. You know how I like to leave you. Always be kind to others as you're kind to yourself, or you might find yourself by yourself. Always shoot high for your goals, because even if you miss, you'll be amongst the stars. And as my good friend and mentor, Art Mitchell, always said to me, it's nice to be important, but you know what? It's much more important to be nice. Until next Sunday, God bless and peace out.
Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. You've been listening to I Am Dad podcast. We hope that you have been informed, encouraged you to think, or even inspired your heart for the love of dads. The conversation does not end here. Come back and join us next week. Same time, same place. Or you can continue the dialogue on our I Am Dad Facebook page. We also invite you to listen to past episodes, learn more about us, and keep up with special activities by visiting IamDadPodcast.com. That's IamDadPodcast.com. Until next time, I leave you with this reminder of manhood from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Because of this reminder, I will always understand that I am dad, period.
You know what it is. Everything I do, yeah, I do it big. Yeah, screaming as